accommodation. Its new permanent home is scheduled to open in September. However, the current DFE budget does not cover specialist technology and equipment required. I have raised this with the Secretary of State for DCMS, and he is committed to looking further whether there's possible funding available from his budgets. Will my right honourable friend look into CAPA's situation and work with me and DCMS to raise the additional £800,000 required to ensure my young constituents, regardless of background, find pathways to opportunity?
State.
Well, I think we all recognise the important role that creative industries have in terms of driving the economy and how important it is that we have the right skills and training young people to have those skills as they go into that industry. I'll be more than happy to meet with my honourable friend to discuss the challenges that he's facing in his constituency and how we can best assist.
Chris Matheson.
Mr Speaker, as a trade union official, I saw union learning centres embedded into workplaces, providing and meeting the needs of employers and employees, and often providing the only continuing education and training for those working people. Union learning works, so why on earth does the government want to abolish it?
Well, Mr Speaker, we are investing in skills right across the country in terms of a lifetime skills guarantee, giving a guarantee and a sense of opportunity to so many people that have never had it before. And in terms of the £12 million, what we're wanting to do with that, we want to invest it in our colleges up and down the country, making sure that they have a real impact in our local communities that we also want. Union Learn was costing £4 million in admin on its own. I think that money is better spent in terms of delivering skills, not just for young people, but people of all ages.
Dick Baker.
Mr Speaker, thank you. At least one school in my constituency is suffering material numbers of pupil absences because the NHS COVID app is triggering through walls. Could he confirm that it's policy that the under-16s shouldn't be using the app? And will he undertake to reissue guidance to schools across the country to make sure we get the most out of keeping schools open?
State.
I can absolutely assure my honourable friend that under-16s shouldn't be using that app, and I'd like to thank schools who have done so much, and the leadership of schools who've done so much in terms of working with test and trace to ensure that the number of youngsters who need to self-isolate as a result of a case has reduced significantly over the past few weeks, making sure as many children are attending school. I'll take up the point my honourable friend has made and look at guidance as to how best we can give people the right and proper steer.
Kate Osborne.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. At a time when LGBT+ hate crime is on the rise, it's extremely disappointing that the government have cut the funding to support LGBT+ bullying education in schools. Can the Minister assure me that an alternative will be put forward so that this vital training can continue to educate our young people in preventing bullying and achieving better mental health?
Minister.
Well, this was the GEO scheme to support a number of anti-LGBT bullying schemes. I've seen these schemes in action myself. They're very, very good indeed. We will be looking at what more the DFE can do after the spending review to ensure that our anti-bullying programmes are LGBT inclusive.
We now come to Kevin Hollingray.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Before we'd even heard of the dreaded word COVID, the excellent head teacher, Rob Williams at Malton School, have put in place a scheme to provide an iPad to all children, including completely free to children who are on accessing pupil premium. Would my right honourable friend agree this should be a national exemplar and roll it out as best practice to other schools around the country?
State.
Well, as a Yorkshireman myself, I'd agree that there are many exemplars that come out of Yorkshire, and the EdTech demonstrators at the department has been rolling out her as a brilliant example of that. And I think what Malton High School's been doing really shows how we can best use technology to support pupils, including those pupils from most disadvantaged backgrounds.
Jamie Stone.
Mr Speaker, our teachers and school staff are doing a fantastic job right now. They're very much in the front line during the COVID pandemic. Could I therefore ask the Secretary of State, could they be treated as a priority when it comes to vaccination? And if he's in agreement with that suggestion, I wonder if he could share his methodology and the way he'll approach my suggestions with the Scottish Government, because the issue is exactly the same in the north of the border.
State.
Well, the honourable gentleman raises an important point in terms of vaccines, and we're working very closely across government to ensure those people who have the greatest clinical need get the vaccine. But he highlights a really important issue, and he wouldn't be surprised to hear that as Secretary of State for Education, I always see education as the absolute priority, but I'll be very happy to work also with the devolved administrations to make sure that we have as combined and coordinated approach as possible, which is really the greatest strength of our union.
Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many schools in West Worcestershire have benefited from the Condition Improvement Fund, but Malvern Parish Primary School, with its leaky, drafty Victorian windows, keeps missing out. So would the Secretary of State kindly look again at their bid?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I have some good news that on the 14th of January, after Christmas, there is going to be an opportunity for them to be able to apply for the next round of condition improvement funding. There's more money in this pot than ever before by the fact that we are spending more money in terms of the improvement of our schools. But of course, I'd be very happy to always sit down with my honourable friend and discuss about her educational priorities, including for her schools in her constituency.
Tammy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have received numerous emails from concerns parents and students about whether or not schools are going to remain open or closed during this lockdown. Now, some parents and students are incredibly frightened at the risk of educational institutions becoming a ground zero site for new spikes of infection. And on the other side of the debate, others are worried that children and young people will miss out on key learning if schools are shut. Now, many of my constituents' concern on both sides of the debates may well be put to rest if testing in schools occurred more frequently for both students and staff. So could the Minister please let us know what steps he is taking to ensure that schools have increased access to testing and that staff are in a safer working environment during this pandemic?
Sarah State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we know how important it is to give children the opportunity to be in school. That's why on this side of the House we prioritised school opening. We had over 1.6 million children back into schools before the summer holidays. We opened the door to all of our schools right across the country to welcome children back, and it's great to see that 99% of schools are open. But we continue to take the safety and the security, not just of pupils but staff, incredibly seriously. And that is why, as every stage of the way, that we'll be doing everything to ensure that schools remain a safe environment. Because as the Chief Medical Officer for England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and the Children's Commissioner for England has said, actually children are best in school.
Duncan Smith.
Mr. Speaker, my thanks for squeezing me in. Can I say to my right honourable friend, it was absolutely right of the government through the tiered system and lockdown to keep schools open against some of the pressure given to him by some of the unions and various others. But can I just say to him, one of the things that many teachers have complained in my area about is the patchiness of some of the advice and the application of whole school groups, sometimes whole year groups, going down because of their fear about infection. I wonder if my right honourable friend or his schools minister would be prepared to deal again with some of the guidance and also possibly come on an online roundtable with my teachers who are very keen to speak to them.
Well, I can absolutely assure my right honourable friend that the schools minister would love to do that with his teachers and is enthusiastically penning in the date. And he is right to say that there has been some inconsistencies. That's why we worked in terms of setting up their national helpline in order to ensure there's a consistency of advice, and working with schools groups and schools trusts to support them to ensure there is a common approach, because we do know that getting children in schools, getting children having the benefit of education and learning, that is what will give them the best opportunities. That is why it continues to remain our focus.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Last month, during National Adoption Week, it was announced that over 600 children are still waiting to be placed with their forever family. I know my right honourable friend has since launched a national recruitment campaign, but could he, despite the challenges of COVID, say what progress is being made and what plans he has to ensure that those children be placed with their forever families as quickly as possible?
Sarah State.
Well, both my right honourable friend and myself share common passion about the importance of adoption, about how we want to be driving up the rate of adoption right across the country. There have been delays in the court service, which has meant that a number of adoptions have been held up. I'm meeting with my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Justice, to see what more we can do to speed up this process, to give children the opportunity to be with a family forever. There is nothing more generous that people can do to open up not just their homes, but to their hearts, to ensure that those young people have the opportunities that we all want them to have.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order. Just before I call the Prime Minister, I would like to point out the British Sign Language interpretation of the statement is available to watch on parliamentlive.tv. Just say some of the screens aren't working, so we're just going to have to see how we go. We'll try and just take it a bit easy if need be. So what I'm now going to do is call the Prime Minister to make a statement. Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. And with your permission, I will make a statement on the government's COVID winter plan. For the first time since this wretched virus took hold, we can see a route out of the pandemic. The breakthroughs in treatment, in testing and vaccines mean that the scientific cavalry is now in sight. And we know in our hearts that next year we will succeed. By the spring, these advances should reduce the need for the restrictions we've endured in 2020 and make the whole concept of a COVID lockdown redundant. When that moment comes, it will have been made possible by the sacrifices of millions of people across the UK. I'm acutely conscious that no other peacetime Prime Minister has asked so much of the British people, and just as our country has risen to every previous trial, so it has responded this time, and I am deeply grateful. But the hard truth, Mr. Speaker, is that we're not there yet. First, we must get through winter without the virus spreading out of control and squandering our hard-won gains at exactly the time when the burden on the NHS is always greatest. Our winter plan is designed to carry us safely to spring. In recent weeks, families and businesses in England have once again steadfastly observed nationwide restrictions, and they've managed to slow the growth of new cases and ease the worst pressures on our NHS. I can therefore confirm the national restrictions in England will end on the 2nd of December, and they will not be renewed. From next Wednesday, people will be able to leave their home for any purpose and meet others in outdoor public spaces subject to the rule of 6. Collective worship, weddings, and outdoor sports can resume, and shops, personal care, gyms, and the wider leisure sector can reopen. But without sensible precautions, we would risk the virus escalating into a winter or New Year surge. The incidence of the disease is, alas, still widespread in many areas. So we're not going to replace national measures with a free-for-all, the status quo anti-COVID. We're going to go back instead to a regional tiered approach, applying the toughest measures where COVID is most prevalent. And while the previous local tiers did cut the number and cut the R number, they were not quite enough to reduce it below 1. So the scientific advice, I'm afraid, is that as we come out, our tiers need to be made tougher. In particular, in Tier 1, people should work from home wherever possible. In Tier 2, alcohol may only be served in hospitality settings as part of a substantial meal. In Tier 3, indoor entertainment, hotels, and other accommodation will have to close, along with all forms of hospitality, except for delivery and takeaways. And I'm very sorry, obviously, for the unavoidable hardship that this will cause for business owners who've already endured so much disruption this year. Mr. Speaker, unlike the previous arrangements, tiers will now be a uniform set of rules. We've also, and that's to say we won't have negotiations on additional measures with each region. It's a uniform set of rules. And we've learnt from experience that there are some things we can do differently. So from the 10 p.m. closing time for hospitality, we're going to change that so that it is last orders at 10 with closing at 11. In tiers 1 and 2, spectator sports and business events will be free to resume inside and outside with capacity limits and social distancing, providing more consistency with indoor performances in theatres and concert halls. We'll also strengthen the enforcement ability of local authorities, including specially trained officers and new powers to close down premises that pose a risk to public health. Later this week, I should say, we will announce which areas will fall into which tier, I hope on Thursday, based on analysis of cases in all age groups, especially the over 60s, also looking at the rate by which cases are rising or falling, the percentage of those tested in a local population who have COVID, and the current and projected pressures on the NHS. I'm sorry to say, we expect that more regions will fall, at least temporarily, into higher levels than before. But by using these tougher tiers and by using rapid turnaround tests on an ever greater scale to drive R below 1 and keep it there, it should be possible for areas to move down the tiering scale to lower levels of restrictions. By maintaining the pressure on the virus, we can also enable people to see more of their family and friends over Christmas. Mr. Speaker, I can't say that Christmas will be normal this year, but in a period of adversity, time spent with loved ones is even more precious for people of all faiths and none. We all want some kind of Christmas. We need it. We certainly feel we deserve it. But what we don't want is to throw caution to the winds and allow the virus to flare up again, forcing us all back into lockdown in January. So to allow families to come together while minimizing the risk, we're working with the devolved administrations on a special time-limited Christmas dispensation, embracing the whole of the United Kingdom and reflecting the ties of kinship across our islands. But this virus obviously is not going to grant a Christmas truce. It doesn't know it's Christmas, Mr. Speaker, and families will need to make a careful judgment about the risk of visiting elderly relatives. We'll be publishing guidance for those who are clinically extremely vulnerable on how to manage the risks in each tier, as well as over Christmas. As we work to suppress the virus with these local tiers, 2 scientific breakthroughs will ultimately make these restrictions obsolete. As soon as a vaccine is approved, we will dispense it as quickly as possible. But given that this can't be done immediately, we will simultaneously use rapid turnaround testing, the lateral flow testing, that gives results within 30 minutes to identify those without symptoms so they can isolate and avoid transmission. We're beginning to deploy these tests in our NHS and in care homes in England, so people will once again be able to hug and hold hands with loved ones instead of waving at them through a window. By the end of the year, this will allow every care home resident to have 2 visitors who can be tested twice a week. Care workers looking after people in their own homes will be offered weekly tests from today. And from next month, weekly tests will also be available to staff in prisons, food manufacturing, and those delivering and administering COVID vaccines. We're also using testing, as the House knows, to help schools and universities stay open, and testing will enable students to know they can go home safely for Christmas, and indeed back from home to university. But there is another way of using these rapid tests. That is to follow the example of Liverpool, where in the last 2.5 weeks, over 200,000 people have taken part in a community testing, contributing to a very substantial fall in infections. So together with NHS Test and Trace and our fantastic armed forces, we will now launch a major community testing programme, offering all local authorities in Tier 3 areas in England a 6-week surge of testing. The system is untried and there are, of course, many unknowns. But if it works, we should be able to offer those who test negative the prospect of fewer restrictions, for example, meeting up in certain places with others who have also tested negative. And those towns and regions which engage in community testing will have a much greater chance of easing the rules, the tiering that they currently endure. Mr. Speaker, we will also use daily testing to ease another restriction that has impinged on many lives. We will seek to end automatic isolation for close contacts of those found positive. Beginning in Liverpool later this week, contacts who are tested every day for a week will only need to isolate if they themselves test positive. If successful, this approach will be extended across the health system next month and to the whole of England from January. And of course, we're working with the devolved administrations to ensure that Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland also benefit, as they should and will, from these advances in rapid testing. But clearly, the most hopeful advance of all is how vaccines are now edging ever closer to liberating us from the virus, demonstrating emphatically that this is not a pandemic without end. We can take great heart from today's news, which has the makings of a wonderful British scientific achievement. The vaccine, developed with astonishing speed by Oxford University and AstraZeneca, is now one of 3 capable of delivering a period of immunity. We don't yet know when any will be ready and licensed, but we have ordered 100 million doses of the Oxford vaccine and over 350 million in total, more than enough for everyone in the UK, the Crown dependencies, and the overseas territories. And the NHS is preparing a nationwide immunisation programme ready next month, the like of which we've never witnessed. Mr. Speaker, 2020 has been in many ways a tragic year when so many have lost loved ones and faced financial ruin, and this will be still a hard winter. Christmas cannot be normal and there's a long road to spring, but we have turned a corner and the escape route is in sight. We must hold out against the virus until testing and vaccines come to our rescue and reduce the need for restrictions. And everyone can help speed up the arrival of that moment by continuing to follow the rules, getting tested and self-isolating when instructed, remembering hands, face, space, and pulling together for one final push to the spring when we have every reason to hope and believe that the achievements of our scientists will finally lift the shadow of this virus. And Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
Can I just say, the Prime Minister, it's a big statement, he ran 3 minutes over, so can I say to the opposition an extra 2 minutes and to the SNP an extra minute? I now call the Leader of the Opposition, Right Honourable Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement and for his telephone call earlier today when he set out a summary of the proposal. Let me start with the good news, the tremendous progress on vaccines. Last week, the Shadow Chancellor and I went to the Oxford Vaccine Group at Oxford University. It was inspiring, it is remarkable to see the work that they are doing. And our thanks, and I think of the whole nation, go to all those who've taken part in the vaccine trials and research, and we wish them Godspeed. I also want to make an open offer to the Prime Minister. Labour will provide any support we can in the national effort to deliver the vaccine safely across the country. That's an open offer. Can I also welcome the fact that the Prime Minister is seeking a 4-nation approach on the arrangements over the Christmas period? We'll obviously await details on this and the evidence that supports the steps being taken, but the 4-nation approach is the right approach. Now for the more difficult bit. The vaccine is the light at the end of the tunnel. The question today is how do we get there and protect lives and livelihoods along the way? The Prime Minister proposes a return to the 3-tier system. That's risky, because the previous 3-tier system didn't work.
Tier 1 areas drifted to Tier 2. Almost all Tier 2 areas ended up in Tier 3, and those in Tier 3 couldn't see a way out, and we ended up in national lockdown. That was the sad reality of the tiered system before, and nobody wants a repeat of that. Now, I accept that the new tiers are different to the old tiers, but many of the questions are the same. They're not trick questions, and I do acknowledge that none of this is easy. But if the Prime Minister is going to carry Parliament and the country on this, they do need answering. Firstly, on the tier system. The Prime Minister touched on this, but which local areas will be in each tier? This is the red-hot question. This is the question everybody's going to be asking over their kitchen table tonight. I had a round table with business leaders this morning, and it's the first question they asked me. The Prime Minister says it will be decided later this week, possibly Thursday. I just can't emphasise how important it is that these decisions are taken very quickly and very clearly so everybody can plan. That's obviously particularly important for the millions who were in restrictions before the national lockdown, because the message to them today seems to be you will almost be certainly be back where you were before the national lockdown, probably in even stricter restrictions. And people need to know that so that they can plan for that. And I really emphasise how important that is for the Prime Minister. Secondly, and the Prime Minister said he wanted uniform rules. Will the tiers simply be imposed region by region, come what may, from the 3rd of December? Or will there be an element of local consultation and negotiation? I understand the uniform rules, but simply to impose it runs the risk of not getting buy-in from local leaders and local communities, which is incredibly important to people complying with the rules. Third, how long does the Prime Minister anticipate each local area will remain in each tier? For those that are going to come out of lockdown and almost certainly go back to more restrictions than they left, that's going to be a very, very pressing question for them. And then fourth, will there be a new economic package to accompany these new tiers? There's huge concern among many businesses about the viability in Tier 3, particularly a strengthened Tier 3. So what new support can they expect? And can I touch again on those who are self-employed, who are outside of the self-employed scheme, the so-called excluded, because they will be hearing a message about the next 3 months in relation to schemes that they are not currently in, and that needs urgently to be addressed. Could I then turn to the public health impact of this approach? Because one of the major reasons that we ended up in a national lockdown was because, in the words of the government's own scientific advisor, SAGE, test, trace and isolate was only having a marginal impact on transmission. It's one of the reasons they suggested a national lockdown, marginal impact on transmission. Now, I know the Prime Minister will talk about increased testing, mass testing, that's welcome, but it's only part of the story, because the other two parts, trace and isolate, are not fit for purpose. SAGE advised and continues to advise that for trace and isolate to be effective, the percentage of contacts traced needs to be about 80%. It's currently nowhere near that level, it's never been near that level, and the figures are not getting any better. The latest figures actually show that every week about 120,000 close contacts, that's people who should be self-isolating, are not being traced by the system. The likelihood of getting the virus under control when 120,000 people who should be self-isolating are moving around their communities is very low. And then only a fraction of people able to self-isolate are doing so when asked to do so. Now, we said to the Prime Minister this needed to be fixed in the period of the national lockdown, and it hasn't been. It's barely mentioned in the Prime Minister's statement today, and many people will be forgiven for thinking that the Prime Minister's given up on trace and isolate and is about to abandon that scheme altogether to reach out for a different scheme, the mass testing. And it's very important that we understand that if we're going into a tiered system, abandoning trace and isolate, or not getting trace and isolate where it is, we are running a major risk. Mr. Speaker, this isn't about knocking those on the front line or knocking those working on track and trace. It's about being grown up about risk. If we're reintroducing a three-tier system without having fixed trace and isolate, that is a major risk, and we all need to acknowledge it, because it begs the million-dollar question, which is how confident is the Prime Minister that the approach he's proposing today will keep the R rate below 1. Because if it doesn't, the infections will go up, they will go back out of control, and we could well be back in a national lockdown. That is the million-dollar question. Mr. Speaker, Labour has backed the Prime Minister on all the big decisions the government's had to take to protect public health, including the 2 national lockdowns. We've done so because we want there to be a national consensus on difficult issues like this, and because we'll always put public health first. Ideally, I would like to be in a position to do so again. But there are huge gaps in this plan, huge uncertainties and huge risks. We will await the detail. We want the Prime Minister to get this right. He's got a week to do so. Can he start by answering these straightforward questions? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'd like to thank the right honourable gentleman for his qualified welcome of these measures. He says that they are risky. It's not quite clear whether he's supporting them or not. I think they're the right thing for the country. I think they're the right way of getting the virus down. If he wants to go back into another or keep a national lockdown on, I don't think that's the right way forward for this country. We want to get the economy moving as far as we possibly can, keep schools open whilst suppressing the virus. He asked when we'll make the announcement about who goes into which tier. As I said to him earlier on, and I said in my statement just now, that will be announced on Thursday. The reason for the delay, Mr. Speaker, is quite simply that we need to see the data as it comes in, and of course we will work with local authority leaders about which tiers that they need to apply. We'll discuss it with them, but in the end, we have to take some decisions and get on and do it. And I think we saw from the last experience, it was those local authorities, Liverpool springs to mind, that went early, that were very collaborative, where they've been most successful actually in getting the incidence down. And some of the things that we'll look at in deciding which tier is appropriate, Mr. Speaker: case detection rates in all groups, case detection rates in the over 60s, the rate at which the cases are rising or falling, the positivity rate overall, and the pressures on the NHS in the region. Those are the things that we will be looking at, Mr. Speaker, as we make our judgment. And they clearly, in some ways, the tiers have been changed. I mentioned the point about curfews. There are extra possibilities for indoor and outdoor sports, as I said in my statement, and indoor and outdoor events, as I said in my statement. It is right that the balance of the impact of these should continue to be tough. And he once again criticises NHS test and trace. Mr. Speaker, people should bear in mind that this operation has helped indisputably in identifying the areas that have the greatest prevalence of disease. It's helped us to drive down that disease in those areas. It's been of immense value. They're now testing, they have capacity of 500,000 a day. They've tested, NHS Test and Trace has done more than any other country in Europe. And what is so exciting about the new lateral flow testing is that when it comes to isolate, there is the prospect of using lateral flow tests, as I said, to check whether or not you're actually infected or infectious, and thereby to obviate the need for the 14-day quarantine. So science is really beginning to ride to our rescue, Mr. Speaker. And it's in that context, with the combination of a tiering system and lateral flow tests and the gradual rollout in the weeks and months ahead of the vaccine, that we're able to come out of the lockdown next Wednesday and make the progress that we've described. I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for such support as he felt able to offer at this stage. I'm aware that his support is one of those things that kind of now you see it, now you don't. But never mind, I'll take it while it seems to be there, at least temporarily, and look forward to further conversations with him next week.
David Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After the tremendous news about testing and the encouraging developments on vaccines, can I welcome the news that the blanket national lockdown is ending? But in the spirit of a wise constituent who told me that if the government imposes stupid rules, we'll all stop obeying the sensible rules as well, can I ask my right honourable friend that the new tiers be imposed at a local level, districts rather than counties or regions? Because restrictions which people feel are unfair to their particular community will simply not be respected or obeyed, and this will itself have a damaging effect on our long-term health.
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend, and indeed the wisdom of his constituent, but I respectfully disagree. The people of this country have been obeying the rules, and it's to an astonishing degree. It's thanks to the heroic effort of the people of this country in following the guidance, in following the recent measures, that we've got the R down in the way that we have, and we've got the incidence down in some of those areas where the disease was really taking off. If you look at the graphs in the northwest in particular, it's now starting to track down across the country, and I have every confidence in the wisdom of the British people to follow sensible guidance and sensible rules. And on his point about local versus regional, alas, the disease is no respecter of borough boundaries, and we have to have some regions in which to constitute the tiers that are sensible and large enough.
Right, let's head up to Scotland with the SNP leader, Ian Blackford. Ian Blackford.
I would like to thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement and for his telephone call earlier today. Mr. Speaker, this morning, people right across these islands woke up to the more encouraging news on the development of vaccines to fight this deadly virus. It is right that we pay tribute to the remarkable efforts of thousands of scientists across the world who've worked at unprecedented speed to produce these vaccines. All those scientists offer us hope that there is a way out of this pandemic based on the primacy of safety for our society. Far too often in the recent past, expertise in science has been questioned or demeaned by right-wing politicians. So let's now ensure that those same politicians never forget it is a commitment and dedication to science that is now coming to our society's rescue. Mr. Speaker, whilst we all welcome that hope on the horizon, there remain for far too many of our citizens who have not received a single penny of support since the beginning of this pandemic. 3 million freelancers, sole traders, and the recently self-employed all remain excluded from any of the economic support established by this Tory government. These include people right across our community: painters, bricklayers, musicians, artists, entrepreneurs and plumbers. Because of the choices made by this Tory government, they now face a Christmas with no help and no support. Mr. Speaker, myself and my party have now been raising this issue since March, 8 months ago. The excluded are not asking for any special treatment, but just looking for some of the same fairness that others have seen. Others have received support. They should also be getting it. Prime Minister, the Chancellor's spending review this Wednesday will take place exactly 1 month from Christmas Day. So I have one very specific question. Will the Prime Minister today guarantee that a package of financial support will finally be put in place for the 3 million people who have been excluded from any economic support? Will there be some pre-Christmas cheer for the 3 million who have been excluded from help so far?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, and I think I don't know who the right honourable gentleman means in his attack on those who don't encourage investment in science. He certainly can't mean this government, because we've put forward the biggest ever programme of investment in R&D, and indeed are creating a advanced research projects facility that will rival that of, we hope, of the United States. We're investing in pure science and applied science at a scale undreamt of by any previous government. I think rising to £22 billion a year at the end of the spending review period. So I really don't know who he's talking about, but it is not whichever right-wing foes the right honourable gentleman has in view. It cannot be this government. On his point about supporting the self-employed, look, this has been very, very difficult, Mr. Speaker, and we're doing whatever we can to help the self-employed and the excluded. 13.5 billion has gone so far, I think more now, to support the self-employed. Those that, particularly in the artistic, cultural sectors, are beneficiaries of the £1.57 billion investment in the arts and culture. But the best thing for everybody is, and there are many things that apply generally, such as the cut on VAT and the bounce back loans of all kinds that are available to and the grants that are available to everybody. But the best thing for everybody in all sectors is to get the economy moving again, to get the virus down and to move forward. And that's the objective of this winter plan.
Mark Harper. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. First of all, Prime Minister, can I thank you for agreeing to meet myself and my honourable friend, the member for Wickham, on behalf of the 70 colleagues who wrote to you at the weekend. We look forward to discussing this matter in more detail later. I think many will hold their judgment on this until we know which areas go into which tiers. I think if you go into tier 3, you'll struggle to spot much of a difference from the lockdown. But can I ask the Prime Minister to set out for each of the restrictions which have such an impact on people and businesses, the impact he's expecting it to have on dealing with COVID, but also the non-COVID health impact and, importantly, the impacts on people's livelihoods, so that we know each measure is going to save more lives than it costs?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. We'll be very happy, and I'm delighted to meet my honourable friend and the honourable member for Wickham, who've written an excellent letter to me. Many of the points I hope that he agrees in that letter were answered in my statement about sport, the curfew, non-essential retail, gyms, personal.
Have you pressed the button, Prime Minister? Prime Minister. Right. I think we're just going to have to stop for a moment till we can have it checked. We're just checking the sound, Prime Minister. We lost your answer. Have you pressed the button by mistake? Muted.
There's nothing wrong now. There's nothing wrong on our end.
It's not our end, Prime Minister. It could well be yours. I wonder if Mr. Hancock would like to take over with the answer. Is one of you going to do it or not? So he's looking at each other. Sorry? We're going to suspend for 3 minutes then. OK. In order to allow the safe exit, I'm now going to suspend the House for 3 minutes.
Some problem with the sound.
Right, before we get too carried away, until we get the Prime Minister back, and we will continue with the questions, if you could pick up the answer that we lost halfway through, is that all right for the Secretary of State for Health?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I'd say to my right honourable friend, in addition to what the Prime Minister said before we lost the audio, is that while the Tier 3 restrictions that have been set out are less stringent than the national lockdown, it is necessary to be able to get the R down under the tiered system to avoid a further national lockdown if the cases still go up. And as we've set out, we have seen some areas of the country see the case rates come down, and now, thankfully, nationally we're seeing the case rates come down. To his final point about the other health and economic impacts, we of course recognise the economic impacts. On the other health impacts, I would simply reiterate what I've said many times before, which is that the health impacts of not locking down and of the spread of the coronavirus going too broad on other health conditions other than coronavirus are also bad. And the best way to protect the health of the nation, both from coronavirus and from all other conditions, is to keep the virus under control.
David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it makes the case for investing in broadband. Can I ask the Secretary of State, though, very seriously, from the lack of tests and PPE, the claims about a protective ring around care homes, while people died in horrifying numbers, the government's abject failure to protect care home residents and care staff has been one of the biggest tragedies of this pandemic. So will the Secretary of State guarantee today that no care home in England will be required or pressurised to admit anyone from an NHS hospital who has tested positive for COVID?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have over the summer put in place a new regime for ensuring that people who have tested positive but need to go to a care home can get the support that they need in a way that protects them and also protects other residents. And that means that nobody leaves hospital without a test, and those who do need to leave hospital with a positive test must be isolated in a CQC-approved isolation facility. We do, of course, need to support people who've tested positive, and hospital is often not the best place for them, but we need to do that in a way that protects all other residents as well. And at the same time, I'm delighted that we're able to announce today the expansion of the availability of testing for care homes, for domiciliary care workers as well, and also for care home visiting, which I know is hugely welcomed.
Mr. Speaker, we've seen huge efforts across Stoke-on-Trent to get COVID rates down, and the City Council have done an excellent job at rolling out testing. Rates are now falling locally, so will my right honourable friend do everything possible to ensure support continues to be given to local health and council services so we do not exit lockdown at the highest tier?
Well, I pay tribute to everybody in Stoke, the Council, the Royal Stoke Hospital and the wider NHS, and the three colleagues in this House who represent Stoke, including my honourable friend, who have worked so hard together to get the high-quality public health messaging out. We can see the cases coming down in Stoke, and as the Prime Minister set out, on Thursday we'll announce decisions taking into account the very latest data on which areas fall into which tiers.
Samuel Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While millions will welcome the fact that they will now be able to shop, worship and associate with friends and family over Christmas, does the Minister not realise how alarming this statement is today? Rather than being grateful for an announcement which allows us to exercise some basic freedoms, should we not be alarmed that the dependence to do the things which normally people would expect in a democracy now rests in the hands of a minister and the state? And will he accept that today's statement will still deny people the right to earn a living, will drive millions into poverty and will still instill fear, and that should indicate that this policy is a wrong track?
Mr. Speaker, the first duty of any government is to keep the citizens of the country that we serve safe. And that is the reason that we take the actions that we do.
Sir Budley.
I hope the Secretary of State won't think me too eccentric.
if I say that on a winter's morning, I like to start my day by swimming the Serpentine and then going to Mass. And of course, he's now abolished both those things the last 4 weeks, and more important, abolished them for hundreds of thousands of people. So my question to him is this, that under any tier, or indeed under any future lockdown, we will never return to the abolition of healthy outdoor sports or going to religious services. There's never been a shred of evidence that they cause any problem. By the way, this is the first time in 800 years that people have been prevented from going to church in this country since the country was put under an interdict by a medieval pope. So we do want reassurance on that. And as we're having this conversation, could you give us some more reassurance about Christmas carols? We don't want it to be just a holy night, and we don't want it to be a silent night either.
Mr. Speaker, I very much hope that we won't have another national lockdown at all. It's one of the reasons that we've toughened up the Tier 3 is to ensure that if areas are in Tier 3, we can get the virus coming down as opposed to just flatten at a high rate as we were seeing before. That way, I hope we can prevent the whole country from ever having to see the sorts of restrictions that we had to bring in order to keep people safe.
Liz Summerall.
Diolch, LaVanguardia. It has to be said that news of the 3 vaccinations brings us a much-needed dose of hope as we face the winter months. And of course, Wales is especially vulnerable to COVID-19 because of our older population and our higher levels of deprivation. Will the Secretary of State ensure that Wales receives a sufficient allocation of vaccines based on need and not per head of population?
It's absolutely vital that we vaccinate fairly across this country, across the whole of the UK, according to clinical need. That is the agreement that we have reached amongst the 4 nations. It's the principle that I am determined to follow, given that the UK vaccination programme is obviously across the whole United Kingdom. And we've therefore, on that basis, agreed a fair allocation of vaccine so that vaccination can occur at the same speed in all parts of the country according to clinical need.
We're heading to your counter, or we hope to be, with Julian Sturdy. Julian Sturdy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the big sacrifices that York residents have made to get the virus down locally, does the Secretary of State accept how unfair it will feel if the city is kept in high-tier restrictions, even when our COVID rate is considerably lower than when we entered Tier 2 and one of the lowest in our regions? So does the Secretary of State agree that the new restrictions policy has to give people hope that self-discipline and resilience will be rewarded?
Yes, I do think that those values are important and should be rewarded. And I hope that the areas of the country where the case rate has really come down a long way and is coming down fast, I do hope that we will see the fruits of that effort. Having said that, it is absolutely critical that areas that need to go into Tier 3 do go into Tier 3 in order to get the case rate down and in order to protect the population. We'll take these judgments based on public health advice and over the forthcoming days. The reason that we haven't set those details out today is that the more data we have, the better. And we want to give businesses time to plan to be able to reopen, but at the same time we do want to take into account the very latest data. And in York, as in some other parts of the country, the number of cases is coming down, and I welcome that, and I want to see a few more days' data before we can take those final decisions.
Let's head down to Brighton with Caroline Lucas. Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If these tougher tiers are to deliver sustained reductions in transmission, then test, trace, isolate has to work better. So will he learn the lessons from countries where compliance with self-isolation is much higher, pay people more when necessary, offer hotel accommodation if needed, fix the app so that people told to self-isolate via the app can now qualify for support? And will the government stop repeating that they've given 13 billion for the self-employed when 3 million of them have been unfairly deemed to be ineligible? It's not good enough to say that it's too difficult or wait till the economy is moving again. Please, Minister, no ifs, no buts, no excuses. When is he going to give those people some hope?
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the whole country knows that we are going through very difficult times, but I hope that the news, especially on vaccines that we've seen over the past fortnight, taken together, offers some hope about the way we can get out of this. She mentions the test and trace system, as did the right honourable gentleman on the front bench opposite. I'm very glad to say that not only is the testing regime and the opportunities that we have to roll out testing expanding very, very rapidly, and I pay tribute to the team, but the contact tracing is also improving, and I'm really pleased and pay tribute to all those who've been working to make that happen.
Let's head up to Penrith and the Border with Dr. Neil Hudson. Dr. Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Quite rightly, we are keeping young people in full-time education at this time. The outdoor education sector provides an amazing parallel education for children, and there are many centres in Cumbria and across the UK. These centres are ready for COVID-secure programmes where pupils who are in bubbles at school can be safely accommodated. Will my right honourable friend work across government to look at reopening these centres as soon as possible for residential visits so that whole cohorts of young children do not miss out on this vital and life-affirming educational opportunity?
Secretary of State.
My honourable friend makes a very powerful case for a sector that is obviously prevalent in his beautiful constituency. And I look forward to working with him to see what progress we can make.
Let's head to North Down with Stephen Farry. Stephen Farry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the progress that has been made on a coordinated approach across the 4 countries of the UK around the Christmas season. Given the particular context of Northern Ireland and indeed all the links across the Irish Sea, can the Secretary of State ensure that this planning also includes the Irish Government? And in doing so, can I suggest that the most immediate priority is clarity around travel arrangements, but some care does need to be taken in relation to the precise guidance around household mixing?
Secretary of State.
Well, yes, I'll absolutely take those points on board in the conversations that ministers are having across the devolved nations of the United Kingdom, and the point that he takes about the enormous number of ties that we have and family ties between the UK and the Republic of Ireland as well. As he knows, the common travel area is there between the UK and the Republic, and so travel to the Republic has never been restricted from the UK side. That's a point of principle and a point of policy, and I know very important for the people of Northern Ireland in particular.
Mr. Speaker, it's welcome news that Ipswich Hospital found out on the 11th of November that they will be receiving £5.2 million for a new molecular laboratory. This will allow the hospital to ramp up rapid testing to almost 3,000 a day by the end of March. We've also heard reports that Suffolk's first site for delivering vaccinations will be ready in 2 weeks' time, with the NHS proposing Gainsborough Sports Centre in Ipswich. Testing and vaccinations are two crucial ways to beat the virus. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that having Ipswich at the forefront of both of these key issues will be a real boost to Ipswich residents?
Mr. Speaker, we put millions of pounds into Ipswich Hospital, and I know that my honourable friend supports Ipswich Hospital very strongly indeed. And I'm glad that across Suffolk and across the whole of the country, we're putting in place now the vaccination hubs that will be there and ready should the regulator sign off a new vaccine. I don't want to intrude on the rigorous independence of the medical regulator, the MHRA, who will make a decision on the safety of these vaccines, but should it be approved, then the NHS will be ready to begin the rollout. And I've set the NHS the challenge of ensuring that they can roll out at the speed at which these vaccines can be manufactured and produced.
Let's go to the MP for Huddersfield, to Barry Sherman. Barry Sherman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And will the Secretary of State impart to the Prime Minister my question that can I beg him at this late stage to change his mind? This is a national emergency. And his policy announced today will end up with critical and perhaps tragic results for my constituents and for our country. The fact of the matter is that as soon as we go to a tier system, and I represent Huddersfield in Kirklees, which is a classic, average, typical town in Britain, we've worked better and harder than anyone else to get rates down, and we have not been successful. Under a national plan, we have started to get there. We've only got to keep ourselves going under restriction for a few more weeks, and we will have the antidotes. Please, change your mind, Minister. Change your mind, Prime Minister. We must stop deaths occurring that could be avoided.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the tiered system that's been set out by the Prime Minister today is calibrated very carefully, learning all of the lessons from the lockdowns that have been in place and also the previous tiered system, and evidence from around the world and indeed from the devolved nations, to be calibrated to be able to bring infections down, but do so in a way that also protects the other things that matter in life as much as possible. It is necessary that this Tier 3 in particular is tougher than the previous, not least because of the experience of Huddersfield and Kirklees and other places that were in Tier 3 for quite a long time, but saw a flattening rather than a reduction in their rates. That's why we've brought in a tougher Tier 3, but it is nevertheless does allow for the opening of religious settings and of non-essential retail, which I know is so important for many.
Millions of people will be delighted to hear that grassroots sports will return from the 3rd of December. Can the Secretary of State confirm that will be the case in all 3 tiers? And also, with regards to the tiers themselves, will consideration be given for variances across big counties and regions? For example, the conditions in the Thames estuary can seem very different and distant from those on the South Kent coast.
Yes, I'm delighted that outdoor sports are able to reopen. Like the Culture Secretary, I have had significant representations from people who want to do exercise, which of course is good for your health, and I'm glad that we've been able to do that. When it comes to the geography of the application of the tiers, of course we've got to look at the areas in which people live and travel, but at the same time, as we did previously, where it is it's clear that you can go and there's a genuine difference that isn't represented by administrative boundaries, then we will look at that and make a decision on that basis. For instance, in the previous tiers, we split a borough in one example, but nevertheless, you do also have to look at where people live and travel in order to get these decisions right.
Van Jones. Speaker, thousands of jobs have been lost in the pub and hospitality sector and are going to be lost. The Prime Minister at the beginning of this crisis said that government actions would follow the science. At a recent meeting with the National Health Director, he was clear that there was no science behind the 10 o'clock, soon to be 11 o'clock curfew, and said it was a policy decision. So if there's no science behind this decision, what are the reasons for it?
Well, we have put in enormous amounts of support to support the hospitality sector, but we do also understand the challenges that the measures that were brought in pose. And the reason behind having to have restrictions on hospitality is that in order to protect the ability of people to go to work and in particular protect education, it is important nevertheless to reduce, sadly, the social contact on which this virus thrives. I mean, it is upsetting, it's frustrating, but it is true, and it's clear from the evidence that we've already had that later in the evening and late at night, social distancing declines, and we know that when social distancing declines, so transmission increases.
Liam Fox. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Prime Minister, through the medium of my right honourable friend, what progress is being made in getting an integration between these lockdown measures and testing at the country's airports? Shouldn't we be following the example of other successful countries in helping to boost business travel, help the airline industry, help inwards and outward tourism, and get the workers at our airports back to full-time employment? What encouragement can you give those in my own constituency at Bristol International Airport?
Yes, this is really important, and it's another example of how the increased capacity in testing that we've built can help improve lives. I've been working with my right honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, and the airline industry and the airports, including the regional airports, which are so important, to try to get a better regime in place, and my right honourable friend won't have to wait very long to get an answer.
I head up to Scotland with Stuart C. MacDonald. Stuart C. MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The uplift to universal credit was a welcome one, but people on legacy benefits, the sick and the disabled, have also faced additional costs and hardship because of the pandemic, and many of those costs were incurred simply to follow government advice on shielding or protecting themselves. So how does he justify not applying the same uplift to those people, and can we have this injustice rectified going forward?
Well, many people in those circumstances also are in receipt of universal credit, and we have put in an increase of £1,000 for those in receipt of universal credit. It is a very significant and generous increase, alongside the furlough arrangements, a very, very substantial package of financial support that the IMF has described as one of the most generous in the world.
The 22, Sir Graham Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I return to the question that was asked by our right honourable friend from Forest of Dean? I think the Secretary of State said that he recognises the damage that's done by these restrictions. Will he go further and publish the government's assessment of what that impact is, both in economic terms and in health terms? And can I also ask him, will he ensure that on Thursday, when it becomes clear which regions are going into which tier, the government publishes the exact criteria which will be used to make that judgment?
Yes, we will publish the statistics that we look at to make exactly the judgments that my right honourable friend refers to. It is not possible to put a specific number on it, though, and the reason that it's not possible is because there are a number of criteria, and you wouldn't, for instance, want to put an area into lockdown, or a higher tier, more accurately, because it triggered numerical criteria if there was a specific reason. For instance, there's been an outbreak at a barracks in the last month, very significant outbreak. It meant that that area looked like it had a huge spike, but it was entirely, literally confined to barracks. And therefore, an element of judgment is important in making these decisions, but what we will do is publish the data on which these decisions are taken. And raise the question also about the economic impact assessment, and I'll raise that point with my right honourable friend, the Chancellor.
We're still hoping to reconnect with the Prime Minister at some point, so in the meantime we'll continue with Jonathan Edwards.
Diolch, Mr. Speaker. The news of the successful development of 3 vaccines is to be warmly welcomed because it offers light at the end of the tunnel. But however, he will recognise that distribution will be a huge logistical challenge. What guarantees can he give that the Welsh Government will receive any additional resources it requires to meet the task at hand?
Where there are the rollout, the vaccines programme is a UK programme, and the costs of the rollout, of course, incur Barnett consequentials and will therefore be available across the whole of the UK. We're working closely with the NHS in Wales to make sure that this happens as smoothly as possible, but it will be the most almighty huge logistical effort for everybody involved.
Richard Drax.
Mr. Speaker, as my right honourable friend knows, I do not support lockdowns, tiered or otherwise, but I welcome the move to get these vaccines, and it's very, very good news. As I understand it, the main weapon the government has is test and trace. Can I suggest test and quick result is equally important? When will the government be able to say, or can tell the House, when the whole country can be tested and get a quick result, so when it's negative, we can all get on with our lives?
I hope that the system, so that people can test daily if they've been in close contact, as the Prime Minister has, with somebody who's tested positive, and that be in place instead of having to isolate as a contact. I hope that that will be in place in January, as the Prime Minister set out. We're piloting it from this week, and then we'll roll it out over December, and I hope it'll be available nationwide from January.
Kate Osborne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Prime Minister, or even the Chancellor, but can I ask the Secretary of State, with the infection rates still high across the North East, it's looking likely that the region will come out of this national lockdown in a worse position than it went in. When the tier restrictions were last implemented, local leaders had to fight the government for a fair amount of funding for our region. Can the Secretary of State assure us that this time the North will not be left behind again, and in line with their levelling up, promise and ensure that all businesses and people receive the correct level of financial support that they so desperately need?
Well, I'm glad to see that the number of cases in the North East is falling, and that's good news and testament to people right across the North East. Yes, there will be financial support to the councils that are in higher tier areas, alongside, of course, the huge amount of financial support to individuals through furlough and through the increase to universal credit, and, of course, to businesses too.
Caroline Notes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Physical and mental well-being go hand in hand, and both are under attack from this virus. I welcome my Right Honourable friend's comments so far on outdoor sport, but at this time of year, it's the fitness studios, the Pilates studios, the dance studios that are crucially important to keep people active. What reassurance can he give the House that even in areas where there is a higher tier, every effort will be made to make sure that people can keep active, recognising the enormous efforts the industry has made to put in COVID-secure measures?
I can give my Right Honourable friend exactly that assurance, and not least as in all tiers, gyms will be able to be open, and I recognise the enormous efforts that most gyms have gone to make sure that they're COVID secure.
Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I talked to Hounslow's Director of Public Health this morning, and she was welcoming the opportunity to have lateral flow testing, rapid testing, under her jurisdiction locally. And we both welcome the fact the government has finally recognised that local health and public health professionals are essential to the successful tackling of infection such as COVID. But councils and primary health trusts cannot altogether roll out rapid testing for vulnerable groups and employ, train and enforce, as just announced by the Prime Minister, and roll out the vaccination programme without significant additional resources. Now, the Army's been helping in Liverpool with the rapid testing, but will the government adequately resource local authorities and local health trusts to deliver what's needed?
State. She's absolutely right to praise local public health officials, and local directors of public health have done an amazing amount of work throughout this crisis, and we work incredibly closely with them right across the country. What I'd say on the resource issue is absolutely, it's very important that further funding will come forward for those areas in the higher restrictions, not least because of the amount of work that we all need to do together.
Let's head to Lincoln with Cole McCartney. Cole McCartney.
As our Right Honourable friend, the Prime Minister, said earlier, 2020 has been a difficult year. And unfortunately for freelancers and directors of limited companies in Lincoln and across the UK, they've had a particularly arduous year, with many of them yet to receive next to no financial report from the government as yet. Whilst today's announcements are welcome, we are moving in a positive direction, many will still have to wait several months before small businesses can return to some form of normality. So I asked my Right Honourable friend to urge his very close friend, the Chancellor, to provide grant funding for these individuals and businesses. Local authorities can and will step in to provide this funding on a case-by-case basis. And to finance this, we can seek the repayment of taxpayer funding from the supermarkets who have quite clearly misused taxpayer support that they do not need. Will my Right Honourable friend back the blue-collar Conservative campaign and right this wrong?
I'd be very happy to look at it myself, and as you say, take it up with my Right Honourable friend, the Chancellor, who, as he knows, will be at the dispatch box on Wednesday.
Let's head to Barnsley with Dan Jarvis. Dan Jarvis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The government has committed to level up the country and, in particular, the north of England. But given the risk that COVID will level us down, can I ask the Secretary of State what assurances he can give that in Wednesday's spending review, the Chancellor will reform the Green Book, replace the Local Growth Fund with a Shared Prosperity Fund, and deliver the investment needed to tackle regional inequalities?
Well, yes, the Treasury has already updated its Green Book, and that is a significant step. And I know that the Chancellor has been discussing this further. The levelling up agenda, Mr. Speaker, is absolutely critical after this pandemic, even more so than it was before. It's the agenda on which everybody on this side of the House was elected with enormous enthusiasm about a year ago, and we look forward to putting that in place with renewed vigour once this pandemic is over.
Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And given how important maintaining fitness levels is in terms of being able to deal with the illness, could the Secretary of State confirm? I heard him say some welcome things about sport, but will people be able to go to indoor swimming pools, for example, and will they be able to play golf?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, golf is back, and outdoor sport is absolutely going to be available under all of the tiers, and we'll be publishing all of the details of this and what works in each tier imminently.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, I welcome the plans in place to test students, enabling them to travel home for Christmas, and I commend the work of St Andrews University in my constituency of North East Fife, who have stepped in to facilitate this. But a gap remains in the new year. We need to ensure students must return to university can do so safely, as well as giving reassurance to the communities in which they're situated. I understand from the COVID winter plan that guidance will follow suit, but on behalf of the Government, can the Secretary of State advise me what engagement is being had with devolved nations about the return and testing of students in January, including discussions around default online teaching?
Yes, it's a really important subject to get right. The use of testing will allow it, make it easier both for students safely to go home and also then students safely to return to university. It's something that I've discussed with my colleagues across the four nations, not least because so many students go to university in different parts of the United Kingdom, and I hope we have a good regime in place for the return of students in the same way that we have a good regime in place for students to be able safely to go home using those new lateral flow tests that we now have available thanks to the huge investment and the work that we did over the summer.
Let's head up to Burton with Kate Griffiths. Kate Griffiths.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So many businesses and jobs in my constituency of Burton are based in pubs and in the brewing industry. They're not set up to provide food, and without further support will struggle to make it through December. Can I ask the Prime Minister, through my right honourable friend, to ensure that any support provided to wet pubs also includes the wider brewing industry, who will also be seeing a significant decrease in trade?
Yes, of course. Everybody knows that Burton is inescapably linked to high-quality beer, and anybody who's been to Burton knows that fact, and my heart goes out to the hospitality industry who've been hit so hard. Of course, there are the schemes available nationally, including, of course, furlough and the support for businesses. There has been more support for the hospitality, leisure and accommodation businesses, and there will be cash grants for businesses that are closed under the new tiering system to try to support people through what are inevitably very difficult times.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While I'm pleased, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State have listened to representation by myself and other colleagues about the importance of reopening, for instance, gyms, golf and collective worship, I'm very disappointed that we heard nothing from the Prime Minister about helping those small business people and small businesses in my constituency who've got hardly little or no help whatsoever, be financially excluded, and should look again at that. But my question, Mr. Speaker, is this, is that following a Freedom of Information request through my local CCG, I looked at GP referrals from September this year compared to September 2019. We saw a huge drop in the number of people referred for instance, cardio, gastric and trauma and orthopaedic. So while we've heard from the government they're going to put extra financial resources into the NHS, can I ask the Secretary of State how is it going to provide the extra staff in terms of doctors, nurses and specialists to get the waiting list down and to meet the surge in referrals?
Yes, I'm glad to say that we're hiring large numbers of people into the NHS. There's over 13,000 more nurses over the last year, for instance. And I'm very grateful to the Chancellor for putting an extra £3 billion into the NHS next year in order to be able to deal with some of the backlogs that were inevitably caused by the virus. Just to answer the first part of his question as well, there will be grants of up to £3,000 per month for businesses forced to close by restrictions in England, and also backdated grants of up to £2,100 per month for businesses in Tier 2 and 3 areas that have suffered from reduced demand, on top of the national schemes. So I want to reassure him that we're doing everything that we can to be able to support businesses in these difficult times.
Rob Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Aylesbury was in Tier 1 prior to the second lockdown, and my constituents accepted the jump to national restrictions on the basis of protecting the National Health Service. Can my right honourable friend reassure them that from December the 3rd, any restrictions will be based on truly local needs, backed up with truly local evidence, so they can see for themselves why the action is needed?
Yes, that's right. We publish unprecedented amounts of data and the data on which these judgments have to be made. I can commit to him that we will look at the precise data, both in Aylesbury, across Buckinghamshire, and of course nationwide, as we make these difficult judgments.
Let's head up to Scotland with Chris Stevens. Chris Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the issues that's not stated often enough is to thank the public sector workers who have gone the extra mile during COVID. I'm thinking particularly those processing furlough payments in HMRC and universal credit payments in DWP, and of course, as the Secretary of State will be aware, the heroic efforts of those who work in the National Health Service. So will the Secretary of State thank those public sector workers for everything they're doing, and can he explain to them why this government believes they should be subjected to a 3-year pay freeze, and whether he thinks that's appropriate?
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to pay tribute to all those who've been working on the coronavirus response, and more broadly across the public and private sectors working together to make this happen. There are clear, significant economic consequences of the actions that we've had to take. And as a country, we're going to have to get through those in the same way that as a country, we've pulled together to get through this coronavirus crisis so far. We're not there yet, but we're making significant progress.
Ray Clark.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. The scientists, their teams and all the volunteers deserve our thanks for getting the breakthrough that we've seen in the vaccine, as does the Secretary of State and the government for funding that research and for acting in anticipation to buy 100 million doses of the vaccine. In that spirit, will he speak to the Chancellor over the next couple of days to advance some of the money that the Prime Minister referred to, the record-breaking increase in science funding, to put it in the hands of those other clinical trials that are funded by charitable funds where fundraising income has dropped? So there's no interruption to life-saving research for cancer and other sources, given that we've made that commitment.
My right honourable friend asks a question that tempts me to give an answer ahead of its time, and I look forward, with him no doubt, to hearing what the Chancellor of the Exchequer has to say on Wednesday.
Let's head up to Leeds with Richard Bergen. Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the Prime Minister announced the end of the first lockdown in late June, the ONS weekly survey estimates around 25,000 people had COVID. But after the government ignored its own scientists' call for immediate action in September, cases skyrocketed. The latest ONS data estimates there's now over 600,000 people with the virus. Cases will soar again if the government just keeps repeating the same old errors, including the failed tier system, which is what it's doing, driven by the pressure of its own right-wing backbench MPs, not by public health needs. Today's measures risk a third wave. Will the government take responsibility for the thousands of deaths and all the pain of bereavement that would cause?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I suppose the good news is that I can break to the honourable gentleman is that we have been able to study the impact of the different restrictions that we've had to bring in a set within Tier 3 that are calibrated to ensure that we can get the rates coming down, using the mass testing as well, which has been so effective in Liverpool, where the rates have come down by over 2/3. Quite a remarkable effort by everybody in Liverpool. I'll put my tributes to Joe Anderson on the record once more. So we can do this, especially if we all act and pull together.
Felicity Buchan.
London is the engine of this country's economy, and my central London constituency is suffering hard. As of Friday, London had a substantially lower case rate than the English average, coming in at 75 points lower, and my constituency was 125 points lower. Will my right honourable friend assure me that London will come out at the lowest tier possible, given the health circumstances?
I can assure my honourable friend that London will come out at the tier that is necessary and appropriate based on the public health evidence. What matters is, as my honourable friend says, the case rate, also the case rate amongst the over 60s, and the direction of travel in both of those. And then, of course, the percentage of tests testing positive, because if you put more tests in, you don't want to then punish an area for having a higher number of positives, and the impact on the NHS. And thankfully in London, the NHS has performed remarkably in this second peak and has coped with it, despite the pressures, admirably well.
I'm going to suspend. We think we're going to get the Prime Minister back, but they just need to check the new line. So I'm suspending the House for 5 minutes while they reconnect. Thanks, everybody.